Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Sharing Lessons Learned, Reflections on the Return of the ABAWD Time Limit. We apologize for the slightly late start. We're dealing with some technical issues that we've got settled now, but just bear with us. This is Alexis Fernandez, Chief of the CalFresh Policy Section, and I'm joined by Amber Bonilla, ABAWD Analyst with the CalFresh Policy Section. We're glad to host you today, and thank you for joining us. Before we get started with today's agenda, I'm going to go over a few logistics. So, due to the high number of registrants, which we're very excited about, but also means that we're going to have to keep the webinar in listen-only mode. With that said, a portion of the webinar will be dedicated to question and answers, and you can actually submit your questions at any time during the webinar via the questions box, which is on the right-hand side of your screen if you left the GoToWebinar tool where it was when it first popped up. You can type your questions in at any time, and then when it's the Q&A portion, we will pose your questions to the guests, and they will address them individually. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but one of the benefits of using the questions box is any unanswered questions will be addressed after the webinar, and we can do that in writing. Also, just as a note, the webinar will be recorded for future reference, so you don't have to worry about writing everything down. Okay, so let's move on to today's agenda. So as you know, California anticipates implementing the ABAWD time limit in some counties beginning in September of 2018. So in preparation of that, we've launched a series of committees and work groups that have been taking a deep dive into ABAWD policy. Many of you attend these meetings on a regular basis. In addition to these efforts, we think it's useful to come together every so often to discuss ABAWD hot topics. So today, we'll be talking to our Western region partners in Washington and Oregon about their experience implementing the ABAWD time limit. Both states have relatively recently lost some waiver eligibility, and we've asked them to focus on sharing lessons learned from an operational perspective. What worked and what hasn't worked quite as well? What have they tweaked since initial implementation? What are some of the key considerations that they would highlight for us with the advantage of retrospect? So today's agenda includes about 10 to 15 minutes of overview with each state and roughly 20 or so minutes dedicated to question and answer. So with that, I will introduce our presenters. From Oregon, we're joined by Candy Quintel, who is the SNAP TANF Workforce Coordinator, and Ann Hilders, who is an ABAWD Analyst, both with the Department of Human Services. And from Washington, we're joined by Corinna Adams, Basic Food Program Manager, also known as the SNAP program. They have a fun name too, and Troy Burgess, Basic Food Program Consultant with the Department of Health Services. They'll each spend a few minutes sharing the highlights of their experience, and then we'll open the session for Q&A. So as we mentioned, it's important that you send those question-ins because the question and answer portion really is what we think would be most valuable and beneficial for folks on the line. And one last note before we jump in. Both Washington and Oregon run state-administered SNAP programs. So when they speak to their experiences as a state, they are sharing from the point of view of an administrator who works directly with clients and eligibility systems. I mention this because I think it would be similar to the way in which many of our county partners will imagine their role. It's also worth highlighting due to the distinction between how California administers their program and the role of the state here. So I just wanted to put that out there for some level setting. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and this is where we're going to test, oh, and I noticed my screen changed. We're going to test some of our technical issues. Candy, are you on the line?
I am.
Great. So yes, and now I can hand it over to Candy.
Okay, so I am Candy Quintal, and Ann Hilders is here too, and Ann Hilders has really been our expert on ABAWD. She is retired policy analyst, and she came back just to focus on ABAWDs for us, and so we are very grateful to have her, and she is going to start us off today.
Okay, so Oregon lost its statewide waiver. We've had a statewide waiver for more than 10 years. So most of our workers in the field did not remember ABAWDs or know what to do with them. So we were starting at ground zero. In 2015, August, I think, is when I came back, and we implemented time limits in 2 counties as of January 1st, 2016. And some of the things that we learned is that the pre-work is really important. We started with having workers focus on the exemptions for the work requirements. And I don't know about in California, but Oregon has a very antiquated computer system, and nothing to do with exemptions has been computerized. And so it's really up to the worker to set the codes and change the codes. So we did a big blitz on the ENT exemptions, and we had workers start to focus on them. And what we discovered is that more than 2/3 of our ABAWDs are really exempt when they started looking at and questioning them on how they could be exempt. So we formed a statewide implementation work group to help us make recommendations towards some of the decisions that we needed to make, like did we want a fixed or rolling clock, the length of the certification periods for a mandatory ABAWD, how we wanted to use our stockpile of discretionary exemptions, and how we wanted to transfer cases between those 2 counties that apply time limits and the rest of the state. So those are some of the things that that work group focused on.
And one of the other things was the definition of what chronically homeless would mean for Oregon.
Yes. And then we talked to our employment and training partners, and what we discovered with the first, before the 2016 rollout, is that we really should have started this process earlier, and we did start it earlier because we added a county for January 1, 2017. And we already know we were going to add probably 2 more counties for January 1, 2018. So talking to our employment and training partners, telling them about the new policies, the numbers of persons they need to expect, the impact on their services, the way they can change their services to serve ABAWDs, because they need to look at things a little bit differently than they were for our traditional employment and training program in SNAP. We needed to create some new or revise current existing forms that they used, and we needed to have them start looking at the creation of workfare sites and maybe some short-term training opportunities for jobs that could be available in their communities, but people needed to be trained to do that with 1 to 3 months worth of training. So we wanted them to focus on some of those things. We also talked to our community partners, and we asked for their assistance. In Oregon, we have an extremely close partnership with our communities, and so we had big meetings where we shared policy with the food share or the food banks, homeless shelters, domestic violence, the parole and probation. There's a never-ending list of people in the community that all deal with the same population. And they sometimes hear about things from our clients that instead of them coming to us, they go to the partners. And so like the homeless population, we had some of them, as they sat down and talked to them, they could identify that, yes, they did meet the definition of chronic homelessness. And so they would pick up the phone and call and have that person talk to a worker on the phone so we could set that exemption for them.
Because we have found that even though we sent out notifications to our participants about what the upcoming changes are, that they need to contact us regarding their exemptions or what their participation requirements are going to be, that having that conversation with our community partners really helps get that message out. Because if they aren't reading their mail, or if they just do not believe that this is going to be a real change and this isn't just a flash in the pan kind of a thing and going to go away and we aren't really going to have impact to them, having those conversations at the community level, they could explain it to them in a different way that they would help to understand the implications of this program, the changes to it. So we find that valuable.
And we did. And then we started sending notices, and we sort of were of the mindset that more notices is better than less. And so before implementation, there were 4 different notices sent out. And we should have started those earlier, and we did start them earlier for the January 2017. We started them 4 months earlier, and really we need to roll that back and start them even earlier. The first one was just an explanation of what's happening and how the ABAWD could be exempt. And we asked them to give us a call if they thought that they met one of those exemptions. And we did have some people who did call us and explain how they thought they met an exemption.
So that is something you have to keep in mind too for implementing this, that you do have to ensure that there is one phone line, because we had a phone line for each of the different counties that the ABAWD could call and make contact with. And so you also have to have a phone line that will allow this, because there is an abundance of phone calls that will start coming in, and so you have to have a system that will allow you to have that, because there were several times that their phone systems went down because of how high the call volume changed due to these notices going out. So it is something to keep in mind, operational, that is an outcome of that.
Yeah, we had more than once phone lines crashed. And the second notice was, and there should be about 6 weeks in between the first notice and the second notice. The second notice was about the work requirements, and we asked if the person was working for pay, for bartering, or as in-kind services, or working as a volunteer, if they would contact us and tell us that they were doing this work. Because for pay, they might have been exempt if it was more than 30 hours or equal to more than 30 hours a week. But but we didn't really collect information about volunteering or bartering because that wasn't needed for eligibility. And so now we were looking at a total different area that workers had not been focusing on in the past. So we asked them to contact us to let us know if they were doing that. And the third notice that went out was an invitation for the mandatory ABAWD to come in for an orientation session, and the sessions were provided by our partners, our employment and training partners, and we had the local offices had workers present at these sessions. And the first thing that they started with was the exemptions, and if somebody thought they met an exemption, they went to talk to one of those workers. And the workers were able to do quite a few exemptions right there in those orientation sessions. The last notice is mailed out, for us it was mailed out about 10 to 15 days before implementation, and it was telling those people who are working about their new reporting requirement. So that's sort of the pre-work that we did. What we found is that if an area would create a local team that was structured just to focus on ABAWDs, that was the best. And to a certain extent, each county did it maybe a little bit differently, but they all have a team or a unit that is structured to work on ABAWDs. Because at first we have the exemptions and different things happening, but as they start doing the work requirements, then we need to have somebody who does that month-to-month follow-up, and it's a workload. So if we have people who focus on that, it allows the other workers to focus on eligibility, which is what they're used to.
And because ABAWDs can be complex, and so to have those, really the policy experts, the program experts on that topic, we did find it helpful to work through all of the processes that need to be developed and implemented in those areas. If there was a team dedicated to it, that this is their focus and this is what they're doing all day without the distractions of all of the other SNAP program that requirements go along with that.
And training, we did statewide training for ABAWD back in the end of 2015, early 2016. And what we learned was we really need to have two types of training sessions. We need a training session for those workers in those areas that are applying the time limit, that focuses on what they need to be doing, and then we need a second training session for the rest of the state, because there are certain things they have to do with ABAWDs. Although they're not applying the time limit, there are other things that they're doing. For example, no matter where the person applies for benefits in the state, the workers need to be following up with the other state if they came here from another state. And because Oregon applied a fixed clock starting January 1, 2016, workers have to go back to January 1, 2016 to find out if any ABAWD has received counting months in another state, because we need to get them coded into our system as having received those counting months. So that was a statewide piece. And then what they do when somebody transfers from a time limit county into their county, and maybe they've already been disqualified because they've received their 3 counting months. And what do they do with those persons? And we did find people would move. They crossed county lines so they could receive benefits in another county without having to have the time limits applied to them.
And something else that we found happened is that we have a no wrong door policy. So if a SNAP participant goes to any place in the state, they can apply or reapply for their benefits at any time, and it doesn't have to be in their local area. So let's say they went to one part of the state that is currently waived, but they still live in an area that is not waived, and they have already used their 3 county months. Well, the other area still needs to acknowledge that they have all of those time limits on there, because they can't open that case unless they regain the whole process that goes along with that. So the rest of the state does need to know what the rest of the policy is, even if they do not have to implement that themselves.
Another thing that we did was we started a weekly question and answer for ABAWDs. We do have people who call in from all over the state, because some applications are taken electronically, and sometimes one area will help out another area by determining eligibility on those applications. And so it was open statewide for anybody to call in and ask questions. And we started, because our time limit implementation was January 1, we started the question and answer in December, and we carried it through April. This year, we started a new county January 1, 2017, and we started in December with the question and answers, and we have it booked through April. So, and whoever wants to can call in. Usually it's those areas that are applying the time limit, but it's what they're struggling with or what they're seeing right now. And so it's one way for them to ask their questions, and for anybody who wants to hear what the responses will be. What we found is that a lot of people, our clients, do not necessarily read their notices that they receive in the mail, or they procrastinate and, oh, I'll get around to calling one of these days. And what happens is that we don't hear from them at all until they've lost their benefits. So we've coded the 3 counting months, and we've terminated their benefits, and now they're calling in and they're letting us know that they've been exempt the whole time, or they went to their orientation session, they found out what their plan is. They've been out doing it, and they just didn't bother to go back and turn in their reports. So we're finding that we have terminated people who for the time limit, and then we have to back out of it because they really did meet the criteria or the requirements. And so while that's good for our clients, it creates work for us. And that's something we really haven't resolved, is how to get people to read or to act on notices they receive. So, and then I think I just want to say that you learn as you go, and we had to make modifications. There was lots and lots of discussion, and I think that that's just to be expected when you're implementing new policies. So.
Well, thank you, Anne. I think this is a good place to remind people to submit any questions they may have for Oregon. And we're going to go ahead and jump to Corinna with Washington, and she's joined by Troy Burgess. And we're going to give them about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
All right. Hi there. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So a lot of what Oregon just said was also our experience in Washington. Our waiver also ended, or we had unwaived counties starting January 1st, 2016. And our fixed timeline, or we also have a fixed clock, which was actually from January 1st, 2015 to December 31st, 2017. So we started in a year into it. So it's kind of interesting. But so our current time clock ends December 31st, 2017. So we are always also checking ABAWD eligibility back to January 1st, 2016. I would say that pre-work is definitely a must, and it's also somewhere, also a place where Washington struggled. I'm probably going to repeat a lot of things that Oregon said, but making sure that your computer systems are up to date and that coding's available. In Washington, it also had been 7 or 8 years since we had ABAWD, and so some of that coding had been turned off, and we had to make sure it was reactivated and up to date. We're still in the process of doing that for a couple of things, but for the most part, just making sure that all of those fields would work properly again was huge, and it took a lot of time. Next, Washington also created a specialized team of ABAWD eligibility specialists, and it took a while to get them trained on everything that they would have to do. They had to learn work registration rules, ABAWD rules, exemptions, and then how they would be tracking and monitoring ABAWD. They also were a huge piece of creating workfare sites for us because we wanted to bring on as many workfare sites as possible. We actually had some of our ABAWD specialized team calling and reaching out to different organizations we thought would be a good fit for workfare sites. What else? And we also used our Washington Food Network, which most of the food banks are connected to get the word out about ABAWD. And we also sent out many notices. The first ones were sent out in October, and that was really just information on our ENT program, kind of trying to be preemptive, like, hey, there's this policy coming down the line. You should probably get involved in an ENT program sooner than later. And then we began to send out notifications that to people we identified as possibly being ABAWD, whether or not they were exempt, in November and December and January. I think the notices, and the reason why we sent out so many was that it wasn't all to the same people. There was a list that was identified in November, and then that list changed for December, and then that list changed again for January because we had new ABAWDs coming on, or we misidentified some. So I think that really having your policy definition of ABAWD down for when you send it into your data request, however that works for your state, however you request a list of clients that meet the ABAWD standard, it's really important to have that down packed, because I think that was one of the places we struggled, because, oh, you forgot to take out the people who are pregnant from that list or something like that. There's always something. So really making sure that everybody is on board with the policy definition of an ABAWD, however your state can do that, is important. We also missed the mark on making sure our call center was involved in these conversations. I'm sure we had many angry call center workers, which is pretty terrible for me because I came from the call center, so I should have known better. So please make sure if you have a call center that they're involved in this process. Another thing that Washington State took a long time to really get down pat was the manual update. We have quite a few manuals. We have our policy manual, and we have our procedurals manual, and then we have our website with ABAWD information. And so having many, many meetings to make sure that all of the people who worked on each one of those sections was up to date and on the same page took a while. So, and I think it's so important because when in doubt, your staff are always going to go back to those manuals. So making sure those are all consistent can be very tedious, especially the more and more people you have to have in the room and the more and more people that have to edit these documents. But it's very important and useful. And then finally, exemptions. Washington State also, we had this great idea about how we were going to use our 15% exemptions, and then that kind of all just flew out the window when we got rolling. So I think having a plan is definitely important. Having your prioritization, this is what we're going to use the exemptions for first and foremost is very important, but also realizing in your first year, you really want to make sure a big chunk of those may be available for mistakes, to be honest, because there are miscodings that happen, or you realize, oh, this person should have been ABAWD back to January and now it's July. I don't want to penalize that client because we didn't see it. So, you'd want to use the 15% exemption. Maybe not for that many months. Hopefully you catch it a lot sooner than that. But even if it's a month or two, having those available as your staff get the hang of it. And leading into that, I'll give it to Troy to talk a little bit about staff training and how really important that is.
Hi, everybody. So I recently came from being a financial caseworker, so this will be a lot about the perspective of what front-end line staff were, how they were trained when this notification change came through last year. So as Karina had said originally, so not only was policy communicating this the change, the financial staff was notified ahead of time that, hey, we have new policies and procedures coming out to regarding work registration and coding with ABAWD. So in just a couple months, a lot of the coding will change. And so when the first original meetings came out to the financial staff, they notified us about the steps that were coming soon. And so when the process started, original desk aides came out with the first stages of work registration and coding. The financial staff were trained with online trainings and in-person presentations. There were around 3 online trainings, which ranged about 30 to 60 minutes each. There were 3 WebExes for statewide lead workers because policy may have varied a little bit depending on the region of Washington. This 3 major WebExes were statewide for all the lead workers to talk about their regional policies and get on the same page about this. And then there were multiple requested trainings as financial specialist office for financial specialist offices and other policies. And so with the training, the financial staff were trained on coding, the dates. So with coding, who is a work registrant who is considered an ABAWD, who is exempt due to things such as health, barriers. There was a lot of work, a lot of great work put into making sure the desk aids were easily learned and implemented. So the desk aids were kind of in a form of, if you fall under bubble A, then please go to the next bubble C for the next step. For example, if you're 18 through 49, then please see this bubble. And then what those bubbles would end up doing is telling you what the correct coding for that specific client. And then a lot of training was put into how to refer those who were considered ABAWDs to the ABAWD work team to create those referrals and get those clients participating with their appropriate activities. And so it's a lot of emphasis on getting the correct coding. Obviously, we can't build Rome in a day, so there was multiple overtimes which were granted to have financial staff come in on a Saturday to update the coding. These overtimes were talked with through policy and created through what we call those ticklers, which are kind of like notifications for each case. They were not they were automated for each specific case that needed to be updated with the correct coding, because our system, ACES, Automated Client Eligibility System, can automatically read if a client was not coded correctly according to their demographics that were coded at the time of application or eligibility review. And so if their coding needed to be updated, these notifications would be set out and at times worked on overtime to make sure that, again, the coding was correct. And so there were updates often with the coding, again due to some policy changes here and there, and because it was an actively changing process, just communication about what the new coding was. And so again, great emphasis on the desk aids. Coming as a line staff, they were greatly helpful in getting and understanding how everything worked and how the clients need to be coded. So, and that is pretty much the spiel on with financial training for the staff.
Thanks. And so what just kind of reminded me what Troy was talking about with multiple policy changes. We also kind of went through a few variations of what we define as homelessness or chronic homelessness, and then there was also a change in how we code veterans who have veteran disability services. So as Troy said, we mainly communicated those changes in policy through the desk aids.
Great. Okay. So we've received quite a few questions, and I'm going to do my best to combine kind of common topics, and I ask you to keep those coming. Again, if we don't get to all of them, we will circle back in writing. But I think this is a good question for both states, and maybe Oregon, you can go first, and then Washington, just for the sake of not speaking over each other. But the question is just about setting context for us. So can you speak a little bit to the size of your ABAWD caseload, the size of your specialized teams in order to serve that ABAWD caseload, and then if you could talk a little bit about their function. Were these eligibility workers? What kind of staff made up your specialized teams?
Okay, so we have approximately 2,500 in one county, Multnomah County, mandatory ABAWDs, and
25,000.
25,000. We have 900 mandatories I just got data. And, sorry, I'm sorry.
We won't hold you to it.
My data said it was 2,500 in Multnomah, about 1,000 in Washington, and then the new counties that just came on, they have a lot of people who should be exempt that are not exempt counted as mandatory at this point, and they're about 2,400.
But
so
originally, when we started first sending out the notices,
we were over 25,000, and of the mandatory pool, we exempted about 2/3 of them.
yes.
So it was a lot of them were exempt, but part of that has to do with coding. Sometimes the case would get, because it's all manual, the case would get coded and nobody ever changed it at research. So that might be part of the problem. The teams, the new county that just came on in January has a 4-person team plus a manager, and the other 2 teams are, other 2 counties have more like a processing center. None of these people are doing initial intakes. They are, the processing centers have people who do recertifications and that type of thing, but the people focusing on ABAWDs are looking at, are they meeting the work requirements? Do they need to code accounting month? That type of thing. The referrals for the employment and training services. So they are focused differently than what an eligibility worker would be doing. So I think that was what you were asking.
Yes. And
okay.
Corinna, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so we started out with 3 counties in Washington with an estimated 40,000 ABAWDs. Now, by April, which is when we got our kind of reports online, we had a total of 31,000, but 20,000 of those were exempt. And then, so we had about, and then we had 2,000, or over 2,000 that were participating, and 9,000 who were at risk or not participating. So we did start having these running reports. So our ABAWD unit consists of 12 financial eligibility staff. So they are staff that were trained as eligibility workers, but now they're on a specialized unit that only works with ABAWDs, similar to Oregon. They don't necessarily do intakes. They, the client is referred over to them when they're identified as an ABAWD. And so that's 12 eligibility staff, 2 lead workers, and a supervisor. And now that we're down to 1 county, we are still keeping all of that staff, because we're kind of hoping that this year can be like our catch-up, so that we can get ready for next year if we have more counties become non-exempt. So now we're down to about 13,000 ABAWDs in 1 county.
So I'm going to ask a follow-up question to you both. It's sort of that you alluded to the fact that your specialized units are not necessarily doing traditional intake, but it sounds like they're working these cases on a regular basis. I would assume monthly. Can you speak a little to, for those ABAWDs who are subject to the time limit, who are expected to meet the work requirement and are or are not, depending on their personal circumstances, how often would you say you're, quote unquote, touching these cases or reviewing them?
In Oregon, we're touching them every month, or we're supposed to be touching them every month.
Because if they are participating, they're having to turn in their attendance sheet, so we have to go in, we have to track that, we have to code the case if they are meeting participation, or if they're not meeting participation, we have to add a CT month, which is a county month. And we also run reports on a monthly basis that they work to make sure that we are catching all of those ABAWDs that are either participating or not participating, because we need to ensure the accurate coding is on there, and if we're having county months coded to their case.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Washington is very similar. If they are participating in an activity or not participating, our ABAWD staff should be looking at them every month. We don't look at exempt cases unless they have an exception that may change, like using the 15%.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, and so now on to a slightly different topic, but something that you also mentioned when you were talking about your caseload facts. This pre-identification effort, particularly with relation to the early notices that you sent, can you talk a little bit more about how you identified cases early on who might be ABAWD subject to the time limit, and then if you had a crystal ball, how early would you send your first notice if you could do it again?
Wow. Okay, to begin with, in Oregon, we identified in those counties where we were going to apply the time limit, those persons who were in the age group 18 through 59, who were not exempt due to something like a disability. And there was no child under 18 in what we call a filing group, but in the household. And we sent out notices. So we sent out a huge number of notices to begin with because we wanted to catch the exemptions, and we wanted to correct exemptions if they were wrong. So we didn't send them to people who have a disability or coded as having a disability, but we did send them to almost everybody else who could be an ABAWD, and we called them our potential pool. Then the next notice went to people who did not get an exemption. So those people who were not coded as being exempt, those are the ones that we sent the information about the work requirements. So we were looking there more at the mandatory population based on the current coding at that time.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
And then, when would you like to send it?
I would say for Washington, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So let's go ahead. Because I think that with implementation in January, that we're looking at sending the next ones out in August, the first round.
So that's about 5 months ahead of the date.
Yes.
Okay, and then
we had problems getting our.
Jump in? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's because we had problems getting our list it came from a different group, and we had to request list for mailing. And so that's a different issue.
I would say in Washington, it was about the same. I think that the main thing to take away from it is that we weren't basing our list on correct coding at the time. We were basing our list on the demographics that were already in our eligibility system. So, you know, like she said, 18 to 59 does not have a minor child in what we call the assistance unit. In our report entity is able to do that, was able to pull a list and take away different aspects, like if somebody was coded as having a disability. So I think that's a really key thing to do when you know your coding's not up to date. And it's also how we would get the list of who was incorrectly coded so that our teams could start working on them. And I would do that as soon as possible. As soon as you know as soon as you know what your waived area or non-waived areas are, I would get on that.
Great advice. Something we're thinking about here as well. We talked a little bit about the fact that you guys are working these cases quite often. Another hot topic here in California is the length of the certification period. So can you speak a little bit to what the technical length of the certification period is for either your entire caseload, or if you differentiate, if you could speak a bit to that?
Okay, so in Oregon, for ABAWDs who are mandatory and they need to be working with our ENT partners for the work requirements, those people are supposed to be certified for 4 months. If normally in Oregon, households are certified, some for 6, but most of them are certified for 12 months. And if we have households that are entirely elderly and or disabled, then they could be certified for 24 months. But those people, none of them should be ABAWDs.
Mm-hmm.
And if they do have an ABAWD in the household with them, well, they wouldn't be certified for 4 months.
Yeah, but if there is an ABAWD and they are working, and we have verified that, so they are meeting participation or exempt, or they meet some other exemption that is going to be ongoing, that we will then certify them for the 12-month period. So it's only those that are having to actively meet participation that we have made the decision to have their cert period be 4 months.
Mm-hmm. In Washington, we have not differentiated the certification period. Our standard 12 months, except for if they meet, they have a disability or are elderly, their certification can be longer. But as she said, those would not be ABAWDs anyway. But so in Washington, we have not shortened the certification period, and I think that's mainly because we do have our team that is looking at these cases monthly anyway.
That's a good
and
point.
they are definitely notified about, their 3-month requirement, or, only having 3 months of non-participation. So.
Okay, great. And this is now a slightly new topic. So, and I'm going to set some context and let our folks on the phone know that Washington and Oregon both have pretty robust employment and training programs, and you all talked a lot about the role of the employment and training programs in terms of good referrals and even encouraging people to start participating early so that they could meet the work requirement in the future. Can you speak a little bit to how likely it is for an ABAWD subject to the time limit to be placed successfully? And if this is a little bit out of your wheelhouse, you can let us know, but if you can speak a little bit to what's a good placement for an ABAWD who's subject to the time limit.
When you are talking about being placed, do you mean actually getting a job?
No, I mean an actual ENT service, I should specify. So not necessarily getting a job, but participating in employment and training activities.
So we do have them go to an orientation, which is, we have a contractor that deals with our employment and training and focused on ABAWDs. So they meet with each of them, they do the orientation, they set up their case plan, and then they are referring them to an activity that they have determined to be best fit for them to meet the participation requirements, and that could be going to a work source center and working to do the job search and job search training. It could be ESL class. It could also be going to a work fair site. And so depending on what their needs are, that's how the determination is made on where their referral is going to be and whether they're going to participate in that activity. And so the actual how many people are actually participating after they are referred, I don't currently have the data on that.
Right. No, I asked for it and I haven't received it yet.
I think that would just be an interesting topic for the future as our counties start to grow their offerings, and many of them are launching employment and training programs for the first time. I think they're thinking heavily about how to successfully engage an ABAWD in ENT services. And
we are also working with our 50-50 program as well, and having those sites also be a viable referral to them too, because they are offering very comprehensive services, and we really think a lot of these ABAWDs will benefit from receiving their services from those 50-50 programs.
Great.
So we're working on expanding the options with them as well.
Great. And so I just have probably 1 or 2 more questions, so your time on the hot seat is almost up. This next question, again, let us know if it's out of your wheelhouse, but do you have a sense of how the return of the time limit has impacted your error rate or any of the kind of quality control activities where they're training for your quality control reviewers? Have you seen any negative impact? And, the best answer you can give, knowing that this is a very broad topic.
Okay, I met with quality control last week,
Oh,
And, and because I wanted to know what some of their processes were. Before I retired, my background was in quality control. So I wanted to know what their processes were for ABAWDs. And that was primarily what our discussion was about. But they said they haven't reviewed any ABAWDs yet that are subject to the time limit. So so I guess we've had it for a year and they haven't pulled any yet.
So it's just a look at the draw and which cases have been pulled, and fortunately for us, ABAWDs have not been pulled yet.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, so we might be getting way ahead of ourselves.
Oh, wait. Washington, we definitely have a comment on that.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So our quality control, speaking of the luck of the draw, decided to come in and do, ours is called, I can't remember what it's called. It's called BPI, and now I'm just totally blanking on what that stands for. But anyway, our quality control did an audit on us in January. So literally, as our staff were trying to learn. Division of Program Integrity. Thank you, Troy. Literally, as our staff were trying to learn. So we had our first quality control audit, and it was pretty horrendous for December and January, which was kind of awkward because in December, technically, we didn't have any at-risk ABAWDs because we still were under a statewide waiver, but they still checked coding, which we knew was incorrect for the most part. And so, yeah, it was not a pleasant experience. However, we had another more of an internal review in June, and we were very pleasantly relieved and slightly surprised that our coding and everything had improved so drastically. So I guess it was good and bad that we got caught in January, and then we got to see our improvement in June. And we are going to continue with an internal review yearly, just so that we can make sure we're prepared for the larger MEs that come around that we actually report to FNF on. But what I would say is it's extremely important as you're doing all of these policy changes to also include your quality control, because many of them go off of the latest version of, again, this goes back to manuals and desk aids. They may go off of a version that you've changed or are planning on changing, or you've gotten further clarification. So it's really important to have them involved whenever you're changing anything. One of the other issues we had is we changed some of our computer system functions, and when the quality control team went to look at that in the past, it messed up their view. They couldn't see what had been previously coded, just what the computer had updated to. So again, just make sure that you loop someone from quality control in every step of the way, because it could really help you on the outcome of your audit.
Great.
And one more thing just to add for Oregon, even though we haven't had a QC review, we do internal reviews as well. And so, especially at the local level, they do this too. So that is how we are catching that there are errors and they're correcting them. So the regular reviews are happening. It just hasn't been a quality control one yet.
That's good to know.
And quality control actually sends people to the training sessions that we have for regular workers. In addition to them, we also include our hearings reps and overpayment writing staff. So there's a broader group of people who are usually looking at older policies, but they are included, and they also were a part of the initial task force.
It sounds like both of your states are using a sort of continuous improvement process, not only in terms of monitoring cases closely so you're catching errors before they get too significant, but also in terms of your policy guidance and reviewing that and kind of adapting as you learn with the process. So these are all very useful insights. And looking at the clock, we're just hitting the 2 o'clock hour. So first and foremost, I really want to thank Candy, Ann, Corinna, and Troy for joining us for today and for being willing to take questions just off the cuff like that. We really do appreciate it. We did receive quite a few other questions that we have a record of, so Amber and I will work through these that are really useful as we continue to think about future webinar opportunities and future discussions for our work groups. And as per usual, you all know I always make a plug for joining the ABAWD committee or ABAWD work groups if you're interested in learning more and keeping up to date. That continuous improvement is something we could do before we're even subject to the time limit. So thanks to everyone today, and we will send out a recording of the webinar in the near future so that you have it as a reference for your notes. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Alexis.